Thank you, Elliot. Boy, that was an Autobahn information, I have to say. Wonderful summary and of all the hard work. I'm going to take a little bit of a different perspective, and sort of my perspective being in clinical engineering for let's see, 20, almost 23 years. And I've had the benefit of being at the same hospital, quite frankly, for the last 21 years, and eventually rolled into more and more responsibilities. And about a year and a half, no, actually 2 years ago, I was tasked to take on IT and all of the technology intensive areas of the Institute. So I'm just going to take an approach where from a clinical engineering background and the enlightenment, I will say, that I encountered. And really the sentiment of my presentation here is going to be more of an empathetic one, that there are so many similarities, some differences, but a lot of similarities between what we all experience from a practical perspective of performing a clinical engineering or a biomedical engineering role in a hospital, and information technology and information services. And it was striking to me, and I seemed to think that I was fairly well versed, had done some quite significant integration projects, new clinical information system rollouts. But when I took on the role of CIO at the Institute, my goodness, I realized just how little I did know. And this is really, the sentiment of this presentation. You'll all recognize this. We can't fix what we don't know. How many times have we always seen a piece of equipment fall down into the biomed of the clinical engineering shop, and all it's written is this device is broken, or we've had this problem forever, or I need this immediately, or patient care will suffer. And we can all sort of navigate through the rhetoric, through the alternatives, and work with clinicians. This is absolutely no different. And I'm sure we've all experienced it in our experience when we're dealing with our own IT or IS departments, is my computer doesn't work. And so it may be just a reflection of everybody here on this call. Maybe next time when you engage your IT department, you may want to be a little bit more specific, as you would expect from your clinicians who are presenting challenges that they're seeing from a technology perspective, because it is no different. Or I can't access this application, or this has never worked. And it's more of just the immediate reaction of maybe having some problems, or I need this application, or I can't do my job. And once again, what are the alternatives? What is the actual situation? So make no mistake, your IT partners in your organizations can experience the same frustrations that you do within a clinical engineering or an IT department. Experts in user base. Here we see a little bit slightly differences. We've all experienced, every nurse or every clinician or every physician being an expert in their field of interest. Maybe not technically, certainly, but they can make the assumption or give the impression that they are. From the IT side, we have to think of it in much broader terms. Every user who can download an app all of a sudden becomes an IS or an IT expert, and those bring real unique challenges to your IT colleagues. Generally, clinical engineering is very clinically focused, right? That's where we're working best at the bedside, whereas IT is generally technically focused. So there are some differences there culturally. Finally, clinical engineering tends to deal with users that are specifically trained in their area of expertise, like a clinician. The challenge on the IT side is that there's a huge, vast variety of expertise and capabilities, much more so than than we would experience working with our clinical patient team and so on. And those brings huge challenges in terms of the different knowledge backgrounds, whether they're technically savvy or technically not, how they interact, how are they familiar with their workstations and their applications. So I would say in this context, be thankful for the people you deal with from a clinical engineering perspective, because they are so focused in those areas. The technology environment. We are all dealing with technology, certainly. In clinical engineering, we have the benefit of dealing in a very highly regulated and controlled environment, whether it's the FDA or the Health Canada, who's monitoring medical equipment, medical technology that is being rolled out. Now, some would argue not ideally or the best way they should be doing it, but nevertheless, it is. In IT, it is so highly unregulated, completely uncontrolled. And although both medical technologies and IT technologies are rapidly changing, roughly a 4 or 5 year turnover, or at least a refresh or a life cycle, in an IT world, it's really the wild, wild west, which was what we would have experienced from the clinical engineering perspective, maybe 40 years ago. And it is extremely hard to keep a handle, particularly in the context of cybersecurity and privacy. Clinical engineering is highly dependent on infrastructure, networking, and wireless, as Elliot just alluded to, particularly on the Wi-Fi aspect. IT, for the most part, is responsible for these. So that requires a real strong partnership between the two. Because not only is IT dealing with potential medical equipment, medical data being transferred over hardwired or wireless networks, but there is a whole slew of other things that they have to manage as well. Both clinical engineering and IT tend to be black boxes. We make issues and projects look easy, very similar. That's the nature of who we are and how we function within our organizations. The hugest challenge I can see on the IT side is BYOD. Can you imagine, as a clinical engineering department, where you had a BYOMD? So you had, actually, this probably happens, I've experienced it too, and I'm sure you all have, of physicians bringing their own medical devices and trying to tap into a network or a particular VLAN they've seen at at a conference, say in Europe or some other country, brings a unique set of challenges in terms of managing from a security perspective. Clinical engineering culturally is life critical driven, and that's their focus, whereas IT is really operational driven from an organization standpoint. So slightly different, but slowly converging. Actually, I should say rapidly converging between these two groups. And just a little example, and there's so many more similarities. When we think about post-market surveillance, when we think about alerts and recalls that clinical engineering does on a regular basis, we get weekly notices from ECRI or the FDA or Health Canada or manufacturers, and we could experience maybe 100 a week that may or may not be attributable to your organization and your technology portfolio. In the IT world, we call that a CVE, a common vulnerability and exposure, which is an exposure, whether it be on an application side, a server side, an operating system. It is open, it is public source, and we typically experience well more than thousands a week that have more often than not a direct impact on the organization as a whole. And that includes medical networks, but also just operational and business networks. And it's a huge, requires, just as we would do on the clinical engineering side, doing risk assessments. What's that impact clinically going to be? The IT group and their team have to do the same, and vetting through what kind of data is housed on a particular workstation or server that has a common vulnerability. In my role, I get weekly alerts coming from our ministry on active CVEs that are being exploited, whether it be ransomware, whether it be phishing attempts. The most recent one for those in Ontario, if you can remember, was the Log4j, which you would know this vulnerability in the States as well, across the world. The Log4j vulnerability was an open source vulnerability, but had dramatic impacts both on the clinical information side of things, but also on just the business. And it essentially shut down the province of Quebec and all of their web applications. So just a little empathy when we're talking about cybersecurity. When we talk about alerts and recalls, often they're just isolated to particular clinical programs. On the IT side, it's across the board generally, including clinically. And so a lot of rigor and attention has to be addressed on that side. And software updates and patching can impact functionality on both sides. Microsoft is not well liked, I can tell you, when they push out their updates, and we know from a clinical engineering perspective, we don't, because we need to isolate out our servers just from a regulatory standpoint, but also we don't know what that impact is going to be functionally on these systems. And it's no different from the IT side. The scale is just, across every staff member as opposed to a particular program. So all that is to say that it's important for IT and clinical engineering really to work together. So we recognize these environments that are extremely technology intensive, extremely IT and IS intensive, but we have to transition from a clinical engineering perspective to understand and how to interpret these diagrams. This diagram on the left is our first foray, which was managed by the biomed group at the Institute in terms of device interoperability when we went live with our Epic instance 2 years ago. And all of the different systems and devices we had doing data interchange directly into our Epic chart. And this diagram on the right is just a snippet of our monitoring network, which is extremely hardware dependent. And then from that foray, then we can get into an environment that's traditionally IT, where they're more familiar with these sort of data center and cloud aspects. So back to the beginning of my presentation, it's important to walk a mile in someone else's shoes. And there's so many similarities in the challenges. And I encourage you to get through that, obviously working as a team, but shadow each other on a frequent basis. We're comfortable within the bedside, within the procedure room, within the OR or the ICU. IT's comfortable in the data center in working with remote monitoring technologies. But it's important to shadow them both and strike up a relationship with your IT group. Sit down with them for a period of time and talk about and share your experiences. Initiate a regular knowledge and experience sharing collaboration where you're looking at projects, you're looking at challenges, you're sharing tool sets. One thing that struck me certainly is there's a great deal of tools available on the IT side that would dramatically help those clinical engineering groups who are trying to interrogate the networks that they support. And their troubleshooting techniques, which are very polished on the clinical engineering side, simply because of the urgency and being able to tackle issues within the OR that are emergency that have to be dealt with, that the IT group can certainly learn from that. I would encourage your groups to pursue a single integrated technology asset inventory. There is such a graying area between these two groups now. So really, we're not thinking of bench to bedside, but really we're thinking of bedside to data center / cloud and all points in between. And by working together, we can see the impacts and the risk management and mitigating risk when it comes to that. You all have the same goal, although sometimes it may not necessarily appear that way. at the end of the day, it's the same goal, and that's to be part of the patient care team, to help clinicians deliver a high level of patient care, and to become technology delivery and support partners and working very closely, collaboratively at the capital side in advance of encountering these challenges. So that is it for me. Very simple, straightforward, but there is a lot to be learned, and empathy goes a long way. And there's a lot of shared expertise and experiences that you would be quite enlightened to hear.